Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to the Rustic Von Lodge. I didn't know if I was going to be able to get up here this weekend, but I did. I'm here at the Rustic Von Lodge. And it is the end of the first week of Garb August. The first week of Garb August has ended. Garb August, the reading event created by CriminOlly to celebrate trashy fiction. Trashy books. Books that are judged by society to be trashy. Doesn't necessarily mean that these books are bad. Just that they're the type of book or the type of books that are judged generally by society to be garbage. Whether they are cheap romances or men's adventure or whatever else. And so the first week, every week, you know how these reading events go. Every week has a theme. And the first theme was sex and violence. I read 3 books for the first week of Garb August, which is a lot for me, actually. But I read 3 books for the first week of Garb August, and I was wise in choosing because, remarkably, they all had either sex or violence or both. How about that? So yes, let us talk about the first 3 books I read for Garb August, the Sex and Violence Week. So the first book I read was The Survivalist, #1, Total War by Jerry Ahern. Jerry Ahern, who wrote this series of books starring the survivalist, a guy that is trying to survive in a post-apocalyptic world, and he's trying to keep his family alive in this post-apocalyptic world. And this series went on for quite a while, I think. I forget how many books there were, but there were quite a few books in this series. And the first one, this is Total War. This is the book where the nuclear war between Russia and America, the Soviet Union and America, go to war and launch nuclear weapons at each other. And because of a super scientific death ray that Russia has, they have a death ray, what amounts to a death ray. Russia basically wins the war, although they are they suffer a lot of damage too. But basically, Russia wins the nuclear war. So that all the Americans who are left have to fight off the Russians when the Russians show up, which I assume is going to be in the second book. But the survivalist has plenty he has to survive. He has to survive the war itself and try to make it back to his family, which I think is going to be the main theme of the first several of these books. And, you know, he has to deal with all those Mad Maxy type characters you have to deal with, crazed bikers, all those kind of characters I'm sure he's going to run across. He already ran across a few in this first initial volume. Now, Jerry Ahern was a guy who loved guns. He loved guns. He wrote about guns. He wrote articles about guns. He had his own line of holsters. So he was way into guns. And so all of the guns, all the weapons in this book are lovingly described. And you get the feeling that all these are on point. All of this stuff is legit. All the weaponry in the Survivalist. Because he took that stuff seriously. Surprisingly, Jerry Ahern is also a pretty good storyteller. He tells a pretty good story. He has a good grasp of character, at least for this type of book. It's a pretty good grasp of character. He has a pretty good grasp of relationships between characters. And so, you know, he has some strengths, this guy. The action in this book is ridiculous. It's the kind of action you'd see in a really cheesy 1980s action movie where you have the hero who inexplicably is pretty much invulnerable. You know, he might get shot like in the shoulder, but somehow that won't really hurt him. You know, stuff like that. Otherwise, he just slaughters everybody. So the Survivalist, I gotta wonder how much of a survivalist. I mean, he's a doctor who decided to work for the CIA to fight terrorists and to teach survival skills. He's always been into survivalism. He wants to teach his survival skills. But this survivalist, how much does he really want to survive? You know, he smokes. What kind of survivalist smokes? He smokes cigars, but you know, how are you going to survive the apocalypse if you've got tongue cancer? You know, if you're a real survivalist, you're not going to smoke and you'll probably be vegan because that way you'll live longer. If you're really into survival, you know, that would probably be you. And you'd probably try to keep out of deadly confrontations. But the survivalist, you know, he's a really macho guy. So there are points where he does really stupid things that in the real world would automatically kill him, like right away. Like there's this group that he wants to get revenge upon. First of all, if you want to survive, maybe taking revenge against large groups of people when there's only a couple of you isn't such a great idea for survival. But, you know, he's a macho, so he wants to take revenge on this group. And so it's a group and they're all armed. And his way of fighting them is to drive his motorcycle right in the midst of them and just kill them all. Now, they're all armed, this large group. And so I guess his hope is that they will be so slow or their aim will be so bad that they will not just kill him. You know, you got to figure in real life, if you did that, you might get a few of them, but they're all armed and they're all going to be shooting at you, right? Anyway, he kills them all. Because this is the equivalent of a 1980s action movie where that kind of thing, you know, can happen. But it was fun. I am definitely going to read more of these. They're just, you know, they're fun. They are what they are. And this was a good example of a men's adventure post-apocalyptic fantasy, basically. So that was the first book, and it was way better than the next book I read. The next book I read was Bio of a Space Tyrant, Volume 1, Refugee by Piers Anthony. This was, well, it was a 5-book series, but eventually he wrote a 6th book in this series. So it ended up being a 6-book series, Bio of a Space Tyrant. And the first, now this is basically the long story about this guy, Hope Hubris, who grows up from being a homeless waif to being a space tyrant. He is the Caligula of the stars. And I do think that Piers Anthony probably read Gore Vidal's Caligula and said, you know, I can do better. I can make something even more offensively awful. And so this is a book which recounts Hope's journey with his family as refugees trying to find a new home in space. And they're with a bunch of other refugees, and they're not even in a real proper ship. They're in this big bubble thing that just kind of floats along slowly. Oh, so slowly. And this group of refugees, they're repeatedly raided by pirates, space pirates. Space pirates raid them over and over and over and over and over and over again. Oh, so many raids by space pirates, and of course they're just terrible rapists. And the book opens actually with a violent sexual assault. There are more horrific sexual assaults throughout the book. There is horrific violence. There are massacres. There's just so much violence. Sexual violence. Sexual violence against children. There's pedophilia. And all of the voluntary sex that happens in this book, because of course this book has that, all involve a 15-year-old boy. So, yeah, it's that kind of book. Now, I heard Piers Anthony could be kind of this way, but this apparently is pretty extreme even for him. Now, all of that stuff doesn't mean that this would be a bad book. But if you're going to put all of that kind of thing into a book, you know, and I get it. He's putting it in there to show all of the stuff that these people have suffered, and how will this influence our young hope who grows up to be a space tyrant. But if you're going to put all of that stuff in your book had better be pretty good otherwise, right? This had better be a good book if you're going to throw all this stuff in there. And it's not. It's, if you take all that stuff out, you have basically what is an okay science fiction story. And that's being generous. It's just okay. The pace is not great. For a book where all of this stuff happens and happens and happens again and happens after that, the pace isn't great. And there are a lot of long scientific explanations that don't have to be there because they don't really help the narrative at all. I mean, why? And so, yeah, so Bio of the Space Tyrant was pretty trashy, but not particularly good. And there are there are 5 other volumes in this series. Now, there are some people who have praised this book. I've read reviews of this book, and some people thought this was a great series. So far, I don't see that in this initial volume. There are good things in there. I mean, it's not hopelessly awful. There's some good stuff in this book, but it's all kind of buried in all this other stuff. So yeah, Bio of a Space Tyrant, I don't particularly recommend it, but it was trashy. Which brings me to the best book I read this week, which was Solomon Kane, the official movie novelization. Solomon Kane, this was based on the film, of course, which is based off of the character created by Robert E. Howard, the Puritan adventurer, the righter of wrongs, Solomon Kane, who was a great character. I've talked a lot about Solomon Kane recently. And this book is written by famed horror writer Ramsey Campbell. And that might surprise you. Now, Ramsey Campbell is a really good writer, but he's known for his horror fiction, and his horror fiction does not tend to be action-packed. He's not an action writer like Robert E. Howard was, but he does have a history with Solomon Kane back in the 70s when Solomon Kane was being reprinted in paperback. Robert E. Howard left a lot of fragments of Solomon Kane, a bunch of Solomon Kane stories that he just never finished for whatever reason. Ramsey Campbell was hired to finish these stories. So you'd have a story where the first couple pages maybe were written by Robert E. Howard, and the rest was written by Ramsey Campbell. And he took this job seriously because he took Robert E. Howard seriously, and he respected this character. And so he researched the period, and he researched the weapons. I mean, he knew how heavy all the weapons were. He knew what was going on at the times that Solomon Kane was having his adventures. He knew a lot, and so he put all of that knowledge into these stories, and they were good stories. He did a good job. They didn't read like Robert E. Howard, and they didn't read like Ramsey Campbell. They were an odd combination of the two of them, where you have stories with action, a lot of action in there, but they were also pretty horrific. They had that horror element that Robert E. Howard had, but Ramsey Campbell really has it. And he did a good job on those stories. And so he was hired. I don't know whose idea it was to hire him, but he was hired to do the Solomon Kane novelization, which is obviously a great choice. He would be the person you'd want to do this. And this book is really good. It's really entertaining. It's a really entertaining, dark fantasy with Solomon Kane. And this is kind of an origin story for Solomon Kane. I mean, Robert E. Howard didn't have an origin for Solomon Kane because I think back in those days, you didn't really feel like you needed to have some obvious superhero-like origin story to provide motivation for your characters, like you do now, apparently. But this book does do that. Just gives Solomon Kane an origin story. And Ramsey Campbell does a really good job. Again, it doesn't read like Robert E. Howard. It doesn't read like Ramsey Campbell. It reads like some odd combination of the two of them. And it really works. A lot of action, of course. This was an action-packed film. Really dark, with a lot of strong horror elements. And so it's a dark horror fantasy that really moves. And he does a great job with the character. So it was entertaining. I mean, it was no masterpiece. It is not going to end up being Ramsey Campbell's best book. But, you know, it's a novelization, which are... novelizations are automatically considered to be trash by the public at large, whether they are bad books or not. Any book that's based on a film or television show, any kind of novelization or tie-in, is generally considered to be trashy. It's easy to see them that way, as a product to sell a film or a television show, because that's what they are, you know. But that has nothing to do whether they're good or bad books. And this was a good book. You could have novelizations that are good books. And they have to stand on their own. So that even if you've never seen the movie, you should be able to be entertained by the book. And this book does that job. If you've never seen the movie, it doesn't matter whether you've seen it or not. The book itself is really entertaining. And he does right by the Solomon Kane character. Ramsey Campbell does. And Ramsey Campbell is a writer I've become very interested in, and I want to read more from him anyway. So this was fun. And this might end up being the best book I read in Garb August. We will see. There are some other contenders. So that was the first week. The second week is vintage trash. And trash that was written before the 1970s. I've started my vintage trash book. It is Trader's Legion, written it says by J. Scotland, but that's actually John Jakes writing under a pseudonym. So John Jakes wrote Trader's Legion, a sword and sandals epic from the 60s. So, and I've read 20 pages of it, and it's really, really good so far. I'm really enjoying it. I've also got Nightwing up here. This is the Killer Vampire Bat novel. And because it's also Book Trek, which I should be talking about soon, Vulcan by Kathleen Sky. Vulcan by Kathleen Sky. Star Trek. So, yeah, I'm set for this week. So later on today, I should have another short video going up. I don't usually do 2 videos a day, but there's a new reading event, another reading event coming out. And so I'll be talking about that later on today. I'll see you then. Okay, guys, I will catch you next time.